Hi, I'm Mike Esneault, and welcome to the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge's AC23 Artist Legacy Series podcast. This is a series where we talk to artists who are doing amazing things in the areas of the arts, including performance, education, production, as well as arts advocacy. We record this series in the Virginia and John Nolan Black Box Studio, as well as in the Jan and Bill Grimes recording studio here at the Carrie Rouge Community Arts Center. Be sure to visit artsbr.org for more information on all the great things we are doing here at the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge. Hope you enjoyed the podcast series, and thanks for tuning in.
Bill?
Just the way we rehearsed it.
Yeah, 5 minutes ago for the first time?
You know, I was looking at the bottom of that page, man. That's an old tune.
When did you write that?
2007.
Oh.
I wrote that in 2007 when I was on a sabbatical.
Well, before we jump into that, I want to welcome all our listeners and viewers to another episode of AC23 Plus Artist Legacy Series put on here by the Arts Council Greater Baton Rouge. And today is a real special day because I have one of my just dear friends and one of the best musicians, if not the best musician I know, Mr.
In this building.
And one of the greatest sense of humor that I also know.
That's up for debate. If you talk to Willis.
Well, my guest today is Dr. Bill Grimes, who doesn't like to be called doctor, but let's keep it real.
Okay, whatever.
Dr. Bill Grimes. Thanks for being here, Bill.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this tune, you wrote it in 2007. It's called Waltz for JB, and explain that title to me.
Well, I wrote it for my son, who's a great drummer. Jonathan Bradford is his name. And so that's, some people call him JB, and I just wrote the tune, and I figured, well, I should do sort of, I need to write one for my other son, Tim, but, so I just titled it for Jonathan, but I just used his initials.
Now, we're both, I think, self-proclaimed music geeks. So why did you pick 3/4? Any idea? I have my own.
If it's a waltz, it has to be 3/4. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Waltz in 4/4?
Dobbins wrote a tune for Claire Fisher called Waltz for Claire, and you can almost play the whole thing in 4. I mean,
really?
It's really, yeah. I don't know. Some of my favorite tunes are waltzes. Mm-hmm. Waltz for Debbie.
Likewise.
Emily. Mm-hmm. Bluesette. You and I have played Bluesette dozens of times.
Love that song.
It's a classic.
Toot Stillman. Yeah.
Yep. I love it. So I love waltzes.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting into into the weeds, so to speak, of a lot of different areas of music and just living life as a musician. But let me tell the listeners a little bit about you. So, Bill is, and we're gonna lose the doctor for the rest of this, and this is Bill. Bill, you're a professional bassist, arranger, composer, conductor, and educator. You've played with people. You've played with Joe Pass, Ileana Elias, Johnny Vodakovich, Larry Seibert, Steve Mazikowski, Bobby Shew, Terrence Blanchard. As an academic educator, you were the director of jazz studies at LSU from 1984 to 2018. You were also associate and assistant dean for 5 years each, respectively. And a side note, your wife, Jan Grimes, who I'm her biggest fan, she started the piano collaborative program at LSU, and we all know her as just an amazing, let me repeat, amazing pianist. And
when I went to Cincinnati Conservatory as an undergraduate, 1972, I was a piano major, and I heard her play.
Yep.
And I said, this is a really bad idea. And my teacher, Mr. Bass, knew that it was a bad idea too, because my second year he gave me the Prokofiev Fourth Sonata. Well, he knew I couldn't play that piece, but I was getting work as a bass player, and Mr. Bass knew this is a good musician. He just doesn't have the technical background to play at this level. But so meeting Jan it was kind of like the first time I heard Jocko play electric bass. That's when I decided to get serious about this. So I can't do that, man. A man's got to know his limitations.
Right. I heard a similar story about Ellis Marsalis, the great pianist that was from New Orleans, and of course, the father of so many amazing musicians, Branford, Winton, etc. But my understanding is when he started playing piano, or we started out as a saxophone player, and he heard a saxophonist down there named Nat Paralat, who was just Coltrane-esque and just an amazing saxophonist out of New Orleans. And he said that at that point, it's piano. Well, okay, tell me how it started. Like, give me. I like to get into the formative years, and how you got into this.
I was born at a very early age,
This whole podcast is going to be like this, which I love.
Look, I love to quote Groucho Marx. So, I grew up in a musical family. My mother was a violinist and a music educator. My dad was not a musician, but he loved music, and he loved to see me succeed, so he was glad to get instruments and lessons and music camps and, whatever.
What did he do?
He was a dentist for 47 years. And the greatest gift my parents ever gave me was when I said I want to major in music. They didn't say, "Are you crazy?" Which is what many parents now say. Sure. And this was a long time ago. This was over 50 years ago that I went to college, and they never said, you need to get a degree where you can make some money. And that happens to a lot of very good musicians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that was a great gift. Thank you, Mom and Dad.
Right.
And then I went off to Cincinnati. I studied piano, and I went off to Cincinnati having played Rhapsody in Blue and a Mendelssohn Concerto and the Pathetique Sonata and blah, blah, blah.
Any bass at this point?
Yeah, I was an electric bass player.
Okay.
Now, I owned a pretty grim acoustic bass, and I played in the local Fayetteville Symphony that my mother started, actually, in 1956. Mm-hmm. And I didn't dig it that much, but I needed to get an instrument and some lessons on how to set up a jazz bass. The right strings. I was playing on gut strings back then, and I know a lot of guys dig them, but I don't. So went off to college, heard my wife play, my girlfriend at the time, and there were some other. They had 36 piano majors in our freshman class. And one of them,
be reminded, this is a conservatory.
Yeah, and one of them was Fred Hirsch.
Oh, wow.
He was in Jan's piano studio.
Wow.
And he would go to his studio class, and all of Mr. Ojeda's students were there. He'd start playing his Bach fugue, and he'd get lost. So he would just start improvising in the style of Bach. And Santos Ojeda was this Cuban pianist, great teacher, and would jump up and down and start screaming. And the other students were going, why can't we do that? Mm-hmm. He was doing this when he was 19 years old. So It was a pretty heavy place.
Right.
But did my undergraduate degree there.
So you finished in piano?
No. No.
Okay.
Oh, no. I switched to music theory. They had an undergraduate degree in theory, which was usually where you throw people who can't play. But then they instituted a jazz major. So I was the first jazz major at the Cincinnati Conservatory, 1977. In the meantime, I had met this brilliant musician named Frank Vincent, who has come to Baton Rouge many times.
I had the pleasure of meeting him back in the day.
Frank was, a lot of people would say, Frank was really a character. Yeah. Studied with Oscar Peterson. Played with some very heavy people. I mean, he was on the road for a short time with Mel Torme. Mm-hmm. And there's some great stories there. And
recorded with
James Brown.
James Brown.
Oh, yeah. James Brown sings standards. It had to be you. Hey, get down. So Frank was an inspiration. And another guy who was there was Frank Brown, who was killed later after I went off to Eastman. But he was, I learned an awful lot from him about how good your skill set has to be. It has to be so much better than everybody else's that they can't not hire you. Mm. And that's what Byron said when he was here.
Yeah.
You've got to be so good that they cannot ignore you.
Right.
So once I got married in 79 to this beautiful woman, been married now for 45 years, and we moved 2 years later to Rochester, where I started graduate program with Rayburn Wright and Bill Dobbins.
Now, before you get into that, I want you to paint the picture for me of what it was you were doing with Frank Vincent. Like, were you playing quite a bit?
I was working 6 nights a week with him.
That's very important.
Oh.
So that was a university in itself.
Yeah, and When I left Cincinnati, I told one of the administrators, I said, "Thank you, I had a nice time here, but what I really learned that helped me the most was 6 nights a week, 9 to 1, night after night after night."
And what was that like? Are you learning tunes on the fly,
Yeah.
like on the gig?
Yeah.
Well, you have charts? Is it by
Well,
ear?
every
or-
now and then Frank would bring in a chart, but I got to be really good at following. There was a story, this drummer and I, he calls me up, Terry Moore was his name. He said, "Hey, man, we got a gig tomorrow night." I said, "Okay, where?" "Danville, Kentucky." I said, "Where?" He says, 4 hours from here." I said, "Terry, I'm not going to Danville, Kentucky 4 hours for a gig." He says, "It's with Teddy Wilson." I said, "All right, pick me up." So we drive down there, and we get there. It's in a small chapel, and there's nobody there. We're ready to rehearse with Teddy Wilson. I'm very excited. 7:30 is the gig. He shows up at 7:15. I said, "Mr. Wilson, such a pleasure, such an honor. You know, do you want to rehearse?" He says, "Rehearse? No, man, we're just going to play." So I positioned myself right at his left hand, and he led me through that gig in the most genteel and nurturing way possible. So we were playing some tunes. I knew a lot of them because I'd been playing with Frank. But all I had to do was just watch his left hand, and he knew when I needed it.
Yeah.
And after we'd play through a tune a couple of times, then I had it. So I've always been a proponent of your ears have to be so much better than everybody else's.
Yeah.
You know, you and I do it when we go to a gig and the singer says, "Let's do it in one of those keys that has sharps and flats."
Sharps and flats.
Yeah, sharps and flats. And so I did it with Larry one night at Gino's. We just
And for our listeners, this is Larry Seabrath, who's a wonderful
brilliant
pianist in New Orleans.
musician
Yes.
and was a big inspiration to me when I got here. And the female singer worked out a key, and there's always some big club. The club owner has a friend who has a date, and she wants to sing with the band.
Sure,
Okay,
sure.
great.
Right.
So Larry gives her an introduction. She comes in a perfect fourth away. Well, within 2 beats, Larry and I had just we didn't even look at each other. We just shifted because that's what you do.
Right.
Now, I would hate to try to do that with a Beethoven sonata.
Be rough.
But think about this. You know, we learn tunes by listening to them. Suppose you learned your Beethoven sonata by listening to a recording of Beethoven playing it. Now, there would be very few people who could play that piece, learning it that way.
Sure.
But the ones who did would have a deep and profound knowledge of what the piece is about.
Absolutely.
And the whole concept of having a memory slip, it goes away.
Well, that's something I've just always been interested in, and over the years gotten more. It's just more solidified with me. Is that music? Yes, it's great to be able to read music. You know, it's
a skill.
It's a skill, a very valuable skill. At the same time, this is an oral tradition, and so much of the music we know, especially in America, is basically not rooted in reading music so much. You know, jazz is kind of because you do find it in the universities, and it helps the process of teaching it. It's an oral tradition. And like you studied with Frank Vincent, I had the pleasure of studying with Alvin Batiste, who was a friend of yours.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very much out of that tradition, you know, listening and learning that way. And to your point, I think when you do learn that way, it's harder, especially initially, but you've internalized it to such a deeper level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So for me, the sight reading thing is vitally important in a commercial sense.
Sure.
So that when I hire an orchestra to play a gig, like with Greg Daigle, we do every January, those people are such good sight readers, we could probably forego the rehearsal.
Right.
And just play the show, because the charts are not that difficult. And just like your charts, my charts are very clear. Mm-hmm. We've spent hours making them just right, so that a good sight reader, there's no excuse not to nail it. And the problem is you get somebody who's a great player, but they're not a good reader. Well, that slows things down. I remember a story of the great Cal Collins, who was a Cincinnati guitarist, incredible player, and played with Benny Goodman in his last days, and did not read. And somebody said, "Cal, is it true you don't read music?" And he said, "Not enough to get in my way." And what he meant was, look, if you got a show or if you got a studio session and there's something that has to be read, I'm the wrong guy. But if you want to go and make music on a very high artistic level, let's do it.
Yeah, it's funny to that point. I remember listening to one of those Marion McParkland shows. She was interviewing one of my heroes, Lyle Mays, but they brought up the subject of classical training, and she says it. She says, "Yeah, I play classical music, but not so much to mess up my jazz." And he fell out laughing.
Well, Bill Dobbins, Willis Filoni, they're perfect examples of people who can play classical music at a very high artistic level, and they're rare.
Yeah, those are the exceptions to the
They
rule.
absolutely are the exceptions.
Right.
So,
So now, okay. So you finished Cincinnati.
right,
and
moved
you
to Rochester,
Moved to Rochester. So tell me about that. Where did you go? What school are you going to?
the Eastman School of Music,
Right.
and I got there, and the same thing happened when I got there as when I arrived at Cincinnati. I thought, oh man, I'm really out of my league. There was so much I didn't know. Even though I had an undergraduate degree in jazz, nobody taught me about my diminished scales. I learned that when I was in graduate school. Nobody had ever showed me the major 7 sharp 5 and how that works, or the chord with the magic hexachords. All those, and undergraduate jazz majors should have at least heard about it. So I started playing with Bill Dobbins. I was there for 3 years in residence, and finished the master's, started a doctorate in music education. My major professor said, "Okay, well, you need to get your teaching certificate." I said, no, I don't want to teach in public schools. I don't want to teach that level. I'm not good at that. I want to teach at the college level." And great for me, he said, "Okay, no problem." So I was there for 3 years, got to play with some unbelievable musicians, people they would bring in for the concerts, like the Arranger's Holiday. Phil Woods was on one of them, McCoy Tyner, Hank Jones, Red Rodney, Bobby Brookmeyer. That was a barrel of laughs. And Wynton, I got to play with Wynton. It was right after he'd won the double Grammy in 1984.
Right.
And he was not happy.
So just for clarification, he won a Grammy in classical music as well as jazz in the same year.
It's unbelievable. And he was not happy because he'd signed the contract before the Grammys were announced, and his price had just gone up. But he was great to work with. All of these guys challenged us. Barry Harris was another one.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
He was just unbelievable. So my third year there, I applied for a job at LSU, and I got the job. So Jan and I moved down here in August of 1984.
No, that had to be pretty significant culture shock.
Oh yeah.
Had you been down here before, ever?
Not this far south. I was from North Carolina, but I'd never been to Louisiana. And it was very interesting. When we got here, we said, well, this is a great first job, but we won't have any kids here. Jonathan showed up a year later. And then we said, well, okay, but they won't go to school here. So both our sons live here.
Right.
And it's been a great place to live. And it was a great place to work. It really was. It was quite an adventure. Interestingly, in retirement, I'm on a new adventure. And so I don't think about LSU very much. In fact, people call me for lessons, and I say, no, I don't. I did that for 34 years. That chapter is closed. I still love to get together with people, and we'd start talking geek stuff and
Sure,
go deep in
sure.
the weeds like with you.
Well, give me an idea of what that looked like, though, because my understanding is prior to you showing up, was there any jazz curriculum at all at LSU?
There was no curriculum. The man who was pushing it was a man named John Edmonds, who was also the marching band arranger and theory teacher. And he's the one who convinced, well, let me back up. The reason they found a position for jazz studies, I was the first specialist, is that the NASM report from several years earlier had chided them for, they said 3 things. You don't have a performance organ for the organist, your music education students are in the College of Education, and you don't have a jazz specialist. And so with the new dean, they were able to fix 2 out of 3.
Yeah, Bill.
A lot of titles, man, come to mind.
What you got? You got one?
No.
Well, you've heard me say this a million times, and for the record, for our listeners, I began playing with Bill probably when I was about 16 or 17, so a couple of years ago, and it's always a pleasure, man, and it's always an education in so many ways. Back then, it was a huge education. I think very similarly probably to. It was very much a mentorship thing, and we've talked about that with you in your formative years. So, I always appreciate it. Okay, so I want to dive a little bit into one thing we haven't really talked about, but I mentioned at the top of the podcast is that in addition to being an educator and a player, you've had quite a career and continue to have a career as an arranger, and you've also done quite a bit of conducting. Talk to me about that.
Well, the conducting has fallen off only because I don't have the right hair. I mean, you look at the great I'm serious, man. Look at the great conductors. These guys have beautiful hair, and when they make that motion, that expressive gesture to the orchestra that nobody looks at, their hair is almost choreographed.
Right.
So it's got. So
are you suggesting that the players aren't watching the conductor?
No, I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying it. So, when I was at Eastman, I was a performance major, but there was also a track for really great writers like Dave Slonaker and Matt Harris and Ellen Rowe and Manny Mendelsohn and Bevan Mann. I mean, just great composers, arrangers. Kim Scharnberg. A lot of them have gone on and done big stuff in Hollywood. And I didn't take that track, but I took a lot of those courses. The one course I never got to take was film scoring. So, and of course, the way they taught it back then is completely different now with the technology.
Sure.
But I remember I was playing in this thing in the summer. I think you were there for it, called the Arranger's Holiday Workshop.
Absolutely.
I played in the orchestra for that. And it was basically a bunch of great sight readers, and the students would take classes in the morning with Ray Wright and Manny Album. Manny was the producer of the early Thad Jones recordings. He was in the booth for those.
And I'm sorry for one sec. So, and for our listeners who might not know, Ray Wright taught arranging and composition and so forth at Eastman. But prior to that, what was he doing?
Music director and chief arranger at Radio City Music Hall for 20 years.
Talk about a gig. I mean, just the experience you have to do that gig.
He told a story to us one day about the business. He said his wife Doris was giving birth to one of their sons, and he was in the father's waiting room, and he's sitting on the floor, and he's got score pages strewn about him, and he's writing as fast as he can because the first rehearsal is tomorrow, and it's got to get to the copyist today. And the nurse comes out and says, "Mr. Wright, it's a boy." He says, "I'll be right with you." Because, it's a deadline.
Deadline's a deadline.
Do it.
Yeah.
In fact, I think you told me the line they use in the studio is called "chasing the stage."
Yeah.
It's no fun.
Yeah. But you get it done.
Yeah. So I studied privately arranging with him, and I also studied conducting with him only from sitting in the orchestra and watching how he did it. And I found that he had three things that I've tried to emulate. Ray was polite to the orchestra. He was incredibly efficient. He wasted nobody's time. And he had a very clear beat with his baton.
And now, one thing that I didn't get to meet him, I only got to meet him once when I was 18 maybe at that holiday, Rangers Holiday thing. But it was the first time I'd experienced, so he's conducting the studio orchestra and, read through it. And then, this is where I was just blown away. He's like, okay, yeah, back in measure 11, second clarinet, you need to check that. And I'm like, wait a minute. Just bionic ears, which you have as well. But I'm like,
no,
whoa.
we're not like Ray's.
Yeah.
The people, they were doing a recording session of a Joseph Schwantner piece, the Eastman Philharmonia, and Ray was in the booth. David Efron's conducting. It's a great piece, but it was one of those Schwantner pieces. It's like a soundscape. And they do a take, and David says over the mic, "Well, Ray, how was that?" And he says, well, it was really good. I think you'll probably want to do another one. And he says, second oboe, measure 46, your F sharp was low. And the whole orchestra, including the conductors, going, how did he hear that?
Right. Yeah.
So Dennis Parker said to me one time, cynically, as only Dennis can be, he says,
he was the cello professor at LSU.
Yeah, he was. I got to conduct for Doc Severinsen, and I did the overture, which was Roman Carnival. And Dennis says, you know, you have a very clear beat, you're polite, and you're a very efficient rehearser. You'll never be a maestro. And he was seriously kidding. But, you know, because a clear look at the great ones. Can you follow those guys?
So what? Well, so what is that about?
I don't know, man. It's
Is it that you know? I understand that the music is familiar music. If you're playing Copland or some, you know, pieces that they played over and over again. But what if you're dealing with some new, you know, 21st century piece? You kind of need to know where that beat is.
Well, the only conducting, with a couple of exceptions, are concerts that I've done with some big orchestras. They're always Pops concerts. So you get one rehearsal. 2 rehearsals is a luxury. So the idea of being overly expressive as a conductor, get over it.
Right.
Because you got to be clear. When the second trombone player looks up, and he or she needs to see a downbeat. So, in fact, I've said to orchestras on more than one occasion, okay, 2 things. Don't play on the upbeat. Don't follow me. If you follow me, you're late. Play with me. And they do. They don't like it, but they do. And then I said, my job is just to get you guys to play with the rhythm section.
Yeah.
And when that happens, the concert is always a success.
Now, one thing that you've got, I've had the luxury of doing it to some degree, but you much more than me, is conducting your own arrangements. And talk to me about that. I mean, that's for me, it's always a thrill, you know, to have spent, you know, many more hours than people realize.
Oh yeah,
putting this music together, and then standing in front of the orchestra or whatever the ensemble is, and conducting it. So
it's a real kick, especially I'll never forget one time I was conducting for Byron, 1998.
Byron Stripling,
yes.
the great trumpet player.
And he hired me to do a thing with the Minnesota Orchestra. Now this is the Minnesota Orchestra. It's not the Minnesota Civic Orchestra. And I had written an arrangement for him of Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans? And that was the first time I'd really heard that bridge that I'd put together that I was kind of proud of. And I'll just never forget it. But then I've also had some good experiences with orchestras playing my own compositions. Like I got to hear the Mobile Symphony did a great job with this overture that I wrote called the Porte de Liberté, the Door to Freedom. And I had written it and dedicated it to my son Tim. He had just graduated from college, and it was actually, because of the rehearsal, I had to miss his commencement. But he came to the concert the next night and dedicated it to him and all the graduates. It was in May. The Door to Freedom is truly education.
Right.
You write that one down. You can use that later. So, yeah. Now, it's not always been fun.
Yeah.
One time I was in Tulsa, and the orchestra wasn't responsive. We need to move that along. That needs to be faster. And the French horn player said, "You need to conduct faster." I said, "Okay." And it was a great lesson because I did, and they did.
Right. I've always found that interesting. When you say that, it also makes me think of like an experience I had where I was kind of learning arranging, and this was in Long Beach. But I was standing in front of the orchestra conducting something, and that I had arranged, just a short snippet. It was part of this workshop thing, and the teacher at the time he could tell I was frustrated because and you know, so he's like, well, what's the problem? I was like, the basses they don't sound right. And he goes, well, you forgot to write slurs over the bass lines. Because I wanted it slurred, but it taught me. It's like, okay, these guys. I mean, I knew this already, but you know, you have to get the spanking, so to speak, to really. And I was like, they really are going to play what I wrote on the page, and that is a little different. I think we both agree when you hand written music, sometimes to improvising musicians, or I'll say jazz, but you know. There's something about that where they kind of, I don't know if it's because they really don't really want to look at the music or they just want to add their thing to it.
Okay, so you and I have talked about this in some of our deep weeds geek sessions. Wind players in orchestras will play exactly what you write. Right. If you have a section at letter A and you've put phrase marks over everything, they'll phrase them beautifully. And if you repeat that at letter D, but for some reason the phrase marks aren't there, they're going to tongue everything. But brass players aren't like that. Right. They don't want to be in rehearsal any longer than they have to, so they're just going to figure out what you want and do it.
Right.
In fact, a couple of brass players chided me, said, "Man, your parts, there's just too much information. You know, you got all these phrases and all these dots and dashes, and we get it. We know what to do."
Right. Right.
String things, that's a completely different thing.
Right.
Because string, you know, you and I like to think of the string section is going to play this phrase. But when a string player looks at it, that's telling them when to change the bow.
It's all about the bowing.
Yeah. But they're usually pretty cool about it. Ray told us a story about a young arranger in New York City who had members of the Philharmonic at this recording session. And this particular arranger didn't really pay attention to the range of the violas. And he said the viola players would always show up with a violin and a viola. And when they got to the section that was too high for the viola, they just put it down and pick up the violin and play it on that. They wouldn't say anything because they wanted to get hired again. But you know, that's what professionals do. Oh, he doesn't know what he's doing, but
right.
Although I don't think you can play a low A on an oboe. It doesn't exist.
Well, you know, one thing I want to play a tune on the way out, but one thing we haven't talked too much about, and I just want you to touch on a little bit, is you have been here for so long via the LSU job, but it is an Artist Legacy Series, and I do like to get people to talk about just the nature of the music scene, especially as a player in Baton Rouge / New Orleans. You have to include that. And how was that? How did that impact you, or did you enjoy that, or et cetera?
I think I'd been here 1 or maybe a year and a half, and I got a call from Larry Siebert, Gino's.
Yeah.
And I show up, and it's me and Larry and Johnny Vodakovich and Tony DeGrati.
Legendary musicians.
And I started playing, and I thought, oh man, this is just like graduate school, except they're better. And the music was at an incredibly high level. And in those days, the people who came to Gino's actually came to listen. You remember the thing you did here with Gino and that whole group?
Right.
But it was an evolving thing. So I'm so grateful that I got the job at LSU. Because I have to admit that I was first introduced here as Bill Grimes. He's our new dance band man. What?
You've told me that.
It's a true story. But because of that, nobody on the faculty knew much about jazz, which means I got to do what I wanted.
And it was needed.
It was needed, but there was nobody micromanaging, telling me, well, you shouldn't hire him. Well, you should hire him. No, I got...
Yeah.
Now, they might say, we can't afford that, but...
Right.
So, yeah, the whole scene here is... well, I think if you talk with Jonathan about this, with the River City Jazz Master Series, a lot of the people who come through here, they're treated really well. They get a good audience. Food is incredible. all of a sudden they said, yeah, I'd like to go back to Baton Rouge, or I'd like
sure.
to go back to New Orleans.
Sure.
It's been a great place to live. You know,
Yeah.
I talked to some of my friends who went to school with, and they live in California, and they still haven't bought their first house because it's just too expensive.
Well, okay, so before we take this thing out, I do want to ask you one more thing, just kind of your thoughts on this, because you've one thing I've always admired about you is, yes, you worked in the university setting, but you could just as easily have and did work outside of the university setting.
Yeah.
And you've made, you know the landscape of making a living as a musician.
Yes.
And you've seen the industry change a lot. And I know we have people who will watch this, young people, who are considering careers in music or, have forged their way into it. But being someone who's so versatile and just a complete musician, what advice would you have for those young musicians coming up?
Well, when I first got into college teaching, the landscape was changing drastically. In the 1960s, if you were a specialist in the music of the Rococo period as it related to the 19th century German symphonic composers, and that's all you did, you'd probably get a job, and that's all you had to teach. And that's a wonderful thing to be a specialist in, but when I got hired, they wanted you to, oh, by the way, you need to conduct the orchestra. Oh, you need to teach a theory class. Oh, somebody's got to teach music appreciation. So
Which became a very popular class on campus because you were teaching it. I know that for a fact.
Yeah, I didn't teach music appreciation, but I taught jazz history.
Well, that's what I'm.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So in the professional world now, I have to say that because I'm 70 and retired, and I'm not stuck in my ways. I'm always curious, but I look at what's passing for music out there now, and I look at the people who are producing it, and I don't think they have to have the musical skills that you and I have developed. There was a young kid down the street from us who came over and saw my studio, and he said, "Yeah, this is nice, but I'm producing." And I said, "Really, music? No, you don't." Elvis Presley said, "I don't know much about music. You don't have to know much in my profession." And so, if they get really proficient at the latest software, and they chase the technology, which is very expensive, I think that would be a terribly boring way to make music.
Right.
With loop-based stuff.
Right.
I use it just as for mock-ups. I would never do anything like that for real.
Right.
Usually because I can't get it to work. But it's advice to young musicians. Realize that you are expendable, which is difficult to accept. I always used to listen to Frank play at the club, and we'd have to play T for two in a cha-cha style. And if you didn't play it the way the dancers had heard at the Arthur Murray Dance Studio, they were on you. They were bugging you.
Right.
And I thought, you people don't understand what a brilliant artist this guy is. But we grow up chasing music, chasing an ideal. We want to sound like the records we love. And then we go out into the world and we get disappointed.
Sure.
So I guess what I'm saying to young students is don't get disappointed. Just realize that it's reality and it's...
Yeah. One thing I would also try to parlay to students when I was teaching more was, get your skill set. It serves your best interest to get your skill set as high as you can get it. But you better be malleable to the situations because, let's face it, as much as you and I both love the music of John Coltrane, that's not always called for. To understand that music.
Unless you want to clear out a club at 1 o'clock in the morning.
But nevertheless, you should try to attain that information and appreciate that art form.
Well,
you know,
it's what drives me to get inside that stuff is I still have my curiosity.
right, and yeah.
And as you and I are both facing, we're going to have to get curious about this new software program called Dorico.
Yeah, it's ever changing.
Yeah, and so the first night I got that news about Finale going away, I thought, that's it. I'm retiring. I'm too old to learn this new thing.
Mm.
And then I woke up and said, let's see. Maybe it's not so bad.
Well, we'll get each other through it. How
Yeah,
about that?
or we'll call somebody who can get us.
Yeah,
through.
we'll hire a tutor.
Yeah. You want to play that bossa nova?
Yeah, before we do that, I want to thank you again, Bill, for being here, for doing this.
Yeah.
I've been looking forward to having you on this.
This was,
so.
You are, you were not really my student. You were a guy who would come around and we would talk about music. So it's the first gig I took you on was at the faculty club. You were in high school, and I brought a lead sheet on Christmas Time Is Here, the Charlie Brown thing. You'd never played it. You played it great. We both made $50, I think. And so then 30-some years later, I'm conducting the LPO. Terrence Blanchard's group is doing a Christmas concert. You're there, and there's your arrangement for full orchestra of Christmas Time Is Here.
Right.
And I thought, man, that circle got completed, you know? Not that I had anything to do with those chops.
Well, you did, actually, because you're the one who got me into orchestra arranging. So you did. You're the one who actually gave me the opportunity to write for live orchestra.
Well, I said, go listen to this Johnny Mandel, Shirley Horn record.
Well.
And that did it. Did it for me.
It's one thing to study it, but then actually have a live orchestra play it. And you facilitated that for me, so that was a big deal. So,
Am I a facilitator? I've been called worse.
okay, so thanks again, Bill, and we're going to play our listeners out to another original by you. Mm-hmm. This is called Living in the Present. Bossa Nova style?
I think I'd been reading a self-help book or something about don't look back because you can't change that. Don't worry about the future because, so it's good advice.
What are we doing here? The last 8 to get us in?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me a tempo. Okay.
1 and 2.
Yeah, Bill.
Mike.
The Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge would like to acknowledge our generous sponsors, the Shell Corporation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Louisiana Office of Cultural Development, and the City of Baton Rouge.